welcome in to the Skol Purple Podcast, episode number 8. I am Carson Schubert, joined by Kevin Brown. And Kevin making his first ever Skol Purple Podcast debut. Kevin, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good. It's good to have you on, man. Followed you for a little bit on Twitter and really find your content interesting and entertaining in relation to the Vikings. So it's good to have you on and hear a little bit about your story and also give us thoughts on the Vikings, current state of the Vikings, and all that good stuff. So thanks for joining us tonight.
It's great to be here. Great to meet you, Carson.
Yeah. Well, man, I think we could go ahead and get started. And wanted to first of all introduce you, and so I'm going to let you tell your story a little bit and how you became entranced, I put here, with the Vikings, and any other part of your story or your life that you kind of wanted to share with the listeners and viewers. So yeah, I'll give you the
Sure.
floor.
So, yeah, I've always been like I played football in high school. Wasn't particularly that good, but I was always very fascinated by the personnel scouting side of it, team building. And when I was still in high school, I compiled this three-ring binder that had little scouting reports of every player in the NFL, and I kept it updated and I took notes and I scoured for scouting report type information, and it was just a hobby. And then in about 1985 through 88, I actually published some books about the Vikings and the draft, and kind of had grown that into a bit of a business and had subscribers and stuff like that. But it was too much of a business, and I enjoyed the writing more than I enjoyed the business side of it. So I kind of auditioned with Viking Update to write an article, a column for them every week, and I was kind of given a one week audition, and they really liked it. And so from 1988 to about 2017, I contributed in one way or another to Viking Update when it went from a weekly newspaper to just a website and multiple name changes and stuff like that. And eventually got absorbed. Um, and then after that, I kind of went all out back into the draft and launched a website called Pro Football Draft Zone, and had kind of an online repository of scouting reports and gifs of highlights and stuff like that. And in 2020, actually print and published a draft book, and it went to press pretty much right when the country went into lockdown for COVID. So it wasn't a super successful venture because of the timing of things then. And it was just a lot of work. So I didn't really sustain that effort, but it was something I wanted to do and accomplish, and did it. So, and then all the while, I've had a day job at a company in Northwest Minnesota. That's a distributor of electronic components, and I worked there for 40 years until retiring in January of this year. So I'm freshly retired after a 40-year career, mostly in brand and marketing. And along the way, was involved in a church plant back in my hometown. And my wife and I moved to Northwest Arkansas in June of 2020, and we love it here. And I guess that brings us up to speed.
All right, awesome. Well, cool to hear a little bit about your story and how you are here today, and looking forward to talking with you a little bit about the Vikings. So, I guess, what are your final thoughts for our listeners on how the Spielman and Zimmer era ended with the Vikings? Obviously, they had some success, and you could maybe argue that they were more successful than the Vikings had been in a while. After the '98 season, it kind of went downhill, I would say. But what were your thoughts to the ending of the Zimmerman and Spielman era with the Vikings?
Yeah, I think it's ironic because I remember Zimmer once said, like, good is the enemy of great. And I think if you were to, encapsulate their tenure together, they were good, but they never really reached greatness for various reasons. And, I think Zimmer was a very good coach, and he was exactly what they needed when they when he came in. And I think him and Spielman started out, very much in lockstep, coaches, kids, and like they were very much on the same page, same philosophy. And I think Zimmer endured some incredible and unusual adversity during his time as a coach. Like Adrian Peterson thing, missing basically a whole year over the thing with his kid, and Teddy blowing out his knee when he seemed to be on the cusp of being the ideal fit for that team, and then Tony Sperano dies right before training camp, and you've just kind of retooled your offensive line, to go that way. And then, in 2020, I don't know if I've ever seen a team ravaged by injuries as much as that team was. And he got them to 7-9, and he had like a Les Steckel caliber roster by the end of that season. And then of course, COVID, but COVID really affected everybody the same. So, um, but I think where Zimmer went awry, if you will, I think was was kind of signaled when Norv Turner left in his third season. And I'm not saying, because of Norv, then everything went south and nobody was good after that. But I think what he came into was, he was hiring a guy that was a really respected offensive coordinator, been a head coach in a couple places. And from an identity standpoint, he was the head coach, but he could focus on the defense, and this guy could run the offense. And, you know, him sort of intervening in Norv's world led to Norv leaving. And then, we had a continuous stream of changes in offensive coordinators and no continuity with the scheme and the personnel. And, then ultimately we took on a quarterback that he didn't want or like. And, that, short of them having great success in those last 2 years, this was sort of destined to go haywire. So when they started losing some close games early, and coaching was a legitimate issue, he became increasingly stubborn, and the culture and trust eroded throughout the building. And in the end, I'd say maybe he was a little too much of a Bill Parcells Belichick disciple, and I think that sort of empowered his stubbornness to the bitter end, if you will. Spielman, I think was a good but not great personnel evaluator. I think a good quality person, extremely hard worker. I think he initiated a real positive culture change. I think he kind of rebuilt and modernized their player personnel department. Um, he got, the scouts and coaches kind of working together, because kind of before that, it was sort of the scouts just go get the players and the coaches coach them. And, there's kind of a continual debate over what the healthy balance is there. But it's beneficial if your coaches are invested in the players you bring in. So, he made progress there. And I think he built a good scouting department. And I think he was an early adopter of some of the changes and leveraging data and the importance of culture issues and stuff like that. But I don't think he was necessarily an innovator, cutting edge for that stuff. And given the direction they've gone, I think that's that you're seeing a stark difference. Um, and I think the other thing about Rick was he really knew how to run a draft and um, identify value on the board, and move around and stuff like that. And he had a lot of very successful picks over the years. Um, and he had some guys that he missed on. Um, but great players like Adrian Peterson and Percy Harvin and Harrison Smith and Kendricks and Daniil Hunter, obviously Stephon Diggs, Dalvin Cook, guys like that. Um, Jefferson, but he missed badly on some guys too. Working back when he worked with Frazier, he did the Christian Ponder thing. That was obviously a terrible pick, and he bypassed better players for a quarterback. And that's probably the most disappointed I have ever been on draft day, was when they picked. It's like I remember where I was on 9/11. Well, I remember exactly where I was
Oh man.
when they drafted Christian Ponder, and I'm just yelling at the screen like, Mike Pouncey, Mike Pouncey. But they had John Sullivan at the time, so they weren't going to draft an offensive line. I'm a big believer in investing in the trenches, so I was pretty disappointed, and then honestly, so then the first pick that Spielman made with Zimmer was Anthony Barr, and I was yelling for Aaron Donald then. And
Oh man.
I'm not saying that because it's glaringly obvious now, but I was at the time, and I thought for sure that if he was there, that's who they would take. Like Zimmer would love this guy, blah blah blah. But they had Sharif Floyd at the time, so they didn't see that as a need. Now Barr has turned out fine. In fact, that wasn't a super great draft year anyway, and I think Barr was a successful pick. But obviously, Aaron Donald would have been a big difference maker. And then of course there was Laquan Treadwell, and
could add Michael Thomas.
Yeah, exactly. And the guy I was yelling at the screen then was a guy named Chris Jones, a defensive tackle who's with the Chiefs. And
sounds like your defensive tackles pretty well.
Well, I like those big guys. And then, I think Garrett Bradbury has been a bust to this point. He's a great fit. He was a super position need for what they were running, but the guy that to me slid to him was Noah Fant, the tight end. I think that's with Denver now, and I think the jury's maybe still out on him too. So, I'm no genius either, but
no.
And then he I think he had really mixed success in free agency. He hit on some guys. I think one of the earlier ones was Shanko, the tight end. And I think Linval Joseph was a good get.
Captain Munnerlyn.
Yeah, Captain was a good hit. And I think he got burned really bad on guys like Medeo Williams and Bernard Berrien, and he overpaid for guys like Alex Boone and Mike Remmers, and that was his effort at trying to fix the offensive line. But the scheme was changing too. So the minute they go get Boone, then the next year they change to a scheme that totally doesn't fit Boone.
So, question I have for you is from what you can see. Obviously, you can't read Rick Spielman's mind, but how much do you think that he actually drafted the best player available? Because obviously, when they drafted Christian Ponder, he was not the best player available, and I don't think he was the best player available on Rick's big board either. But it was kind of a panicked move where he's like, "Oh, we need a quarterback, so I guess I'm just going to go get this guy."
Yeah, I think they just got dialed into that strategy that they were looking at that draft. I think he viewed it as, it isn't a great draft, like for impact, like it wasn't a great draft. And if you look at that draft, very, very few real impact players. So I think he felt like if there was ever a year to try to find a quarterback that would be a developable guy, he was the guy. And I think they I think they legitimately had visions of him being the next Fran Tarkenton or something. But it was a huge reach, and I think they strayed, and I think they've strayed from best player because they didn't want to draft over where they thought they already had a player. Like I mentioned, the Sharif Floyd thing and stuff like that. But you know, I remember like when they drafted. I suppose it was Denny Green era. They drafted Robert Smith, and they already had Terry Allen. And I don't know, like it just works out. Like you just need to do that. And you know, if you drafted Aaron Donald and you already had Sharif Floyd, well, that wouldn't have taken any time at all to pan out because
Yeah.
Floyd had the injury thing. That was very unpredictable, and he probably, he probably was going to have a solid career. But
Well, even a Vikings example of that was, Chester Taylor just had
yep,
1,200 yards, and then they drafted Adrian Peterson. It's like, at the
yep,
time, I remember sitting there with my parents. I'm like, why the heck would we get a running back when we just had 1,200 yards of Chester
yep.
Taylor? But well,
But that
we'll,
was a great pick, best player. Like
mhm.
I think he slid past a couple teams that really blew it, not taking him, and he was just right there, and they had to take him, and I think he'd have been better served sticking to that. But to some degree, and he did this in Miami too. Like I think he catered too much, or he put a little too much stock in trying to please the coach and give the coach exactly what he needs, the right scheme fit, the right, like he kind of overthought that, you know. And I think he learned that over the years, and I think he would have done better. And when you're picking later in the draft, it does end up being a little bit more of a need thing, than because you don't have a high pick, so we gotta fill this hole with this pick, so.
Yeah.
But and then I think like on the on the trade side, I mean, obviously he traded for Jared Allen. That was a home run. Um, I thought the Bradford trade was a bit panicked, but he was a really good player. He just couldn't stay healthy. And then the Ngakwe and Herndon trades just seemed very panicked. Like I don't know. I don't think he got well. I mean, he didn't get great value for either of those deals.
Yeah,
Uh,
Herndon for sure. I mean, I think the Ngakwe one, yeah, you could also say that with because didn't Daniil Hunter get hurt, and that's what the kind of the
yep,
big.
yep. And they thought they were pairing him with Daniil Hunter, so it did make sense. But he just was never really an ideal scheme fit. He was just an edge rusher, like a one trick pony, like not enough of an ability to set the edge. And that wasn't going to be like Zimmer wasn't going to like really get the most out of a guy like that. You know, he'd have been a good player
Yeah,
for the scheme that probably run this year. But
yeah, yeah. New now a 3-4. Yeah.
but
Well,
I think what went down at the end. I think at some point late in the season when it was clear they weren't going to even get to the show to make a run or have a chance at it. I think he went into self-preservation mode, and I think he tried to kind of separate himself from Zimmer, and I think he thought legitimately, hey, this was a team the last 2 years built to win, and when they don't win, that's coaching, and we need a different coach. And I think he thought he could separate from that, and I don't think Zimmer wasn't going to let him do that. I remember Zimmer saying early on in this thing, like he basically, I don't think I'll ever have any trouble with Rick because the minute one of us stops talking to the other, we're both going to be out the door. So that's exactly what happened. You
yep.
know, and I don't know. He can. I don't know. I think it's kind of, it's bush league that the only thing he's actually said was through his girlfriend's
Mm,
Instagram account or something. Like, I don't
mm.
think that's who should be speaking for his brand, but whatever.
Didn't even address the team
Didn't it?
afterward.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't even address the team. And like Spielman did that. He came in and he met with the players, and he released a statement right away that was the right thing to do. And yeah, he maybe jumped right into the media tour a little quick, but um, he's gifted in that area. That's what he was doing, between stints when the Vikings hired him. So,
Yep.
he'd be great on draft day. Um,
Yeah.
and he's gotten a look from the Jags, and I suspect he'll turn up again with a team. And I think he's solid. Like I've talked to him personally a few times and had really deep conversations about deep, important philosophical things. He's a really good guy, and he's very good at this, and I'm sure he's learned from the mistakes. But all that said, it really was time to move on from both those guys.
Yeah. Well, and even Spielman admitted how his philosophy of drafting quarterbacks changed over the last few years compared to
Yep.
what it was when they drafted Christian Ponder. So, and I think that's good that you're able to admit that. But also, the Vikings didn't take a quarterback since 2014 when they took Teddy Bridgewater in the draft. So, I would have been interested to see how Rick would have approached this year because it's from all indications that I heard prior to the 2021 draft or even in and after the draft, the Vikings were pretty well in on Justin Fields if he fell to them. And
Yep.
some people are saying, well, that's not true. But if Justin Fields would have been there, I mean, that would have been quite a pick. I mean, that would have been. And then the Vikings obviously traded down and then drafted Darisaw when Fields wasn't there. But
Yep.
do you think there was any truth to that? And I mean, that
Oh, I think
probably would have been a good pick.
yeah, I think he was in play. I I think I think a couple of those guys were in play for them. Um, but the part that was hard for him was, a different offensive coordinator every year, and so there wasn't continuity. So it was such a moving target, um, to find the right fit. But and I do, I think he learned things from, you know, on one level, Ponder had all these measurables, but on some level, he had some other measurables that now Rick would say are more important to look for.
Yeah.
Um,
Seems like he missed the ability to process things quickly.
yeah,
Like he's very intelligent, Christian
yeah,
Ponder, very intelligent guy, and he had some of the intangibles you're looking for, but just could not. And there's not a lot of people that can, you
yeah,
know, process that quickly. So
yeah. And I think that is, he probably has data now that shows him exactly that. That shows him guys that have panned out and guys that didn't, and that one specific skill set, how they are with that. And like I think, looking into this year's draft, it's like, quarterback's the hot topic of conversation, and those same questions will be asked about these guys too. So
well, I think we spent more time on Zimmerman and Spielman than I expected.
yeah,
um, but that's all right. I mean, it was a long era, 8 years. So I mean that well, and Spielman obviously before Zimmer, but
yeah, and he
yeah,
was there. Yeah, he was there for I think 14 years, 16 years, something
yeah,
longer than most GMs yet.
yeah, because
So
he started out as VP of player personnel, I think, right, and then transitioned into the
yeah,
GM role in was it the year they hired Childress,
yeah,
or
I
was it
think
after that? Maybe
yeah, I think it
it might
was.
have been Frazier. It might have been
I
his
think
Frazier, his first head
he
coach.
was there. He was there for Childress. He pretty much built the Childress teams.
Okay, okay,
Um, but he came after that Fran Foley debacle when the Wilfs hired Fran Foley to be their GM, and he had one terrible draft, and then they brought Spielman in, and then it was set up with this triangle of authority, which was ridiculous. And then he quickly became, truly the personnel guy. And I think when they hired Zimmer, I think Zimmer was his guy. Like I think Frazier was, deserves a chance to be the guy. But then, I think when they did the search and they landed on Zimmer, I think he was on board with that. Like I don't think that was thrust on him at all. So I think they were hitched, but I think rightly so. I think the Wilfs the last 2 years had the expectation that this team was good enough to win games, and it was a huge disappointment when they didn't. So,
would you agree that the beginning of the end of Zimmer and Spielman was the Kirk Cousins signing? I mean, that just kind of seemed like there was a falling off between both of them in that, and then it just kind of almost seemed like that maybe ruined the relationship, or the working relationship, a little bit, and then it just kind of escalated a little bit from there. And but I guess that's just my thought. What do you think on that?
no, like you see the press photo of when they signed him, and the expression on Zim's face compared to the other guys is like screaming, "I didn't want this guy," you know. Um, but if that was truly the case, he needed to throw an absolute tantrum and say, "I want to just re-sign Teddy. I'll put my job on the line if he gets hurt again and doesn't work out." Like whatever his plan was, instead of Kirk, he needed to pound the table for it then. But then when they come out of there, like that has to be our decision, and whether on purpose or what, or if that's just his coaching style. The fact that it's his fourth year before he even talks to the guy, like that was just too big of an investment for both of them for him not to do everything he could, you know, to forge a relationship with them. And you know, and because he didn't do that, he became the defensive coordinator as the head coach, but he never got out from just being the defensive coordinator. It was defense versus offense, and the defense was always good, and the offense wasn't good enough, and the special teams weren't good enough. And then when the defense wasn't good either, well, he lost all his credibility at that point. So it imploded.
There you go.
Ah,
There it is.
oh,
Yeah, you can kind of tell right there that's
yeah, that.
not the most thrilled.
So I don't know. And I know like PA said that if the quarterback wasn't named Teddy, he didn't have time for him. And I
Yeah.
know he loved Teddy, and that was a crappy deal. What happened to him? But I also know at that time, like they felt like they were good enough to contend, and they couldn't risk, just going with Teddy again. And Zim was never a fan of Keenum's either. And
Yeah.
and I don't think they felt like Bradford or Teddy could hold up injury wise. But in retrospect, they would have been probably just as well off.
Yeah.
Signed Bridgewater because they would have, made a decision. He either was good enough for Zim or he wasn't.
And just imagine the amount of money that they could have saved if you went with Bridgewater. I mean,
exactly. And they could have built more of a team around him, and they could have probably created a better offensive line. And
Zimmer would be happy. Teddy would be happier, probably with a better offensive line. Like even in Denver, he didn't have a very good offensive line this past year. I mean, it improved, but it still was not great from what I saw. But yeah, well, I think we're. I'm gonna have to just move on here. We could keep talking about this for a long time, but um, just talk to me a little bit about your excitement for the new era. Obviously, 2020, 2021 didn't end the way the Vikings wanted it to, but what are your thoughts on this new era of Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi Adofo-Mensah?
It's very exciting. It's the first time I think in my time following them that it's been a clean slate where they really are building from the top down. GM and a head coach at the same time. Usually it was a transition of one or the other along the way. It was very exciting, and it was very interesting that they set out like what was important to them, and they were all in on the culture thing and the work environment and this kind of next gen leadership style and diversity, and they did a full blown search. And who they ended up with, both those guys, I don't think anybody would have said at the beginning of the process, oh, that's who Minnesota will get. They'll get Kwesi and they'll get Kevin O'Connell. That's who they'll get. But I think as they went through the process, those guys exactly fit what they'd outlined. And that's a really healthy way to do it. And I think they've got some really good, smart people at the top, and that know how to do that kind of thing. And it's the best they've done it ever. And there's a lot of reason to be excited.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited. I think most Viking fans are excited. I did see on Twitter recently that there was one person that already has a Fire KOC or a Kwesi. I can't remember if it was Kwesi or KOC Twitter account made already as like, oh, people already are just going crazy.
Yeah. Well,
But that's the way it goes with the crazy Twitterverse out there.
yeah, it's a fickle bunch. So
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, well, what have you thought about the new Vikings coaching staff so far that Kevin O'Connell has put together behind him? I mean, it's pretty much a complete new coaching staff, other than basically Keenan McCardell is the only holdover, it seems like, from the old staff. So, um, are you a fan of a complete clean slate, or were you hoping to keep a few guys? I think Andre Patterson sticks out to me as a guy that I would have liked to seen back.
yep, and that he really would be the only other guy. But I also think that the desire to shift to a 3-4 as a base defense and the personnel that means was a philosophical thing. And I think because of that, maybe that wasn't the best thing. And I don't know to what degree Andre wanted to stay, you know, after everything. I think he's pretty well respected and liked. But no matter how good you are somewhere, sometimes it's just time to move on. And this was his second stint with the Vikings. He was loved like that when Denny Green had him on his staff too, and then he eventually left working for Denny Green, and I think went to Dallas straight away then. So, but I like what he's done. Like I can't honestly tell you, like, oh yeah, I've always had my eye on Brian Angelicchio. But the profile of the guys that he hired, they fit. They're consistent with what they say. They want, they're younger guys that can relate. Like he said, I'm not going to hire a coach that can't relate to players, and they have to check that box, and I think that's important. And I think getting hiring Pettin as his assistant head coach was a smart move, because he's a guy who's been a head coach and he spent time with the Packers and he spent last year with the Bears. He knows this division, and he was a very good defensive coordinator in his time, and um, I think he got dinged for the way he called games, you know, in the playoffs with the Packers. But he's a well respected coach, and I think that a young coach needs a guy like that to kind of back him up. Um, I think the defensive coordinator at Donatel. I think a really solid veteran, experienced guy that he he does not need to do anything more than really just set the tone and personality that he wants to see on defense. And I think that guy and his staff will run it from there. And I think how he built out his staff. They're guys that players love playing for, and are good teachers. And I was hopeful that they would bring Durante Jones back from LSU as their DB coach, because that's a really important spot. And I think Mike Smith getting him from the Packers was a bit of a steal. Um, and I think he's a really excellent coach for exactly what they want to transition to with these edge rushers, stand-up guys. And the guys in Green Bay loved him. And if you Packer fans hated to lose him, so that must tell you something.
Yeah.
And
there was no good riddance attached to his name.
No, exactly. And then on the offensive side, I think Wes Phillips, super experienced guy. I don't, people might just think, oh, he was just a tight ends coach, but he played quarterback and coached quarterbacks in college, and he was in the wide receiver room with the Cowboys back when they had guys like Terrell Owens and Terry Glenn and Roy Williams, and then later even Des Bryant. And then he spent at least 2 years working with the old linemen there under Hudson Houck. And then he worked with Callahan when he was with Washington. And then, most recently tight ends and involved in that Rams offense. So he's a super well-rounded and still very young. I think he's 43 or something. Coordinator. And I suspect he'll eventually, if the Vikings have success, he'll be a hot name to be interviewed. So I think this Curtis Modkin's well respected as a running backs coach, run game coordinator. I think McCardle was the one guy I think that everybody thought should stay, and he wisely did. And then I don't know much about the special teams guy, but he fits the mold of exactly what they were looking for. And the assistant guy seems like a younger Mike Prefer to me. So
there you go. Awesome. Yeah, that's it's an interesting staff. I'm kind of the mindset right now where if where I'm in complete trust of what KOC thinks is the way to go, and I'm just gonna kind of let it play out. And he might be wrong, he might be right. I guess we'll find out. But
yeah,
I think the end of the Zimmer era. We talked about the offensive coordinator. You mentioned how that changed pretty much every year. I wonder how much of that had to do with Zimmer, because there's people that are like, "Oh, Zimmer didn't have any say in the offense," but I think he really wanted to run the ball. I mean, that was pretty clear. I think he made it very clear in press conferences. He made
yeah,
it clear even when he was trying to talk with the offensive coordinator last year, Clint Kubiak. I mean, he was so intent on, oh, hey Clint, we got to run the ball, we got to do this, we. So I don't think Zimmer was lost in the offensive side. I wish he would have taken more of a back seat and just been like, okay, I hired somebody that I trust, But I think it was more of, oh, I hired somebody that's going to listen to what I want to do,
Yep.
philosophy wise.
Yep. And yeah, I think that's all of that relational thing of how he portrayed himself as it goes with the offense. That's what spilled over to the players' confidence on the field. And they played like they were just one play away from getting yanked or making a mistake. They weren't playing loose and free and confident. And that was him that influenced that. And so I think that it was and honestly, when you've listened to the same leadership guy for 7, 8 years, it might just be time for a new voice anyway. And
Yeah.
if they would have won, 2, 3 of those games early in the season, that could have gone either way, and they made the playoffs, and maybe they even won a game in the play. We probably wouldn't be having this conversation about this right now. So, it's such a razor thin line between Zimmer and Spielman suck, and these guys are great.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can just change on a dime. So,
Mm.
but that, and it's easier to assess after the fact. But I don't think, I think, I think a guy like Norv leaving, I think was telling about how difficult maybe he was to work for. And I think when Jerry Gray left or was not renewed, and he was a well-respected secondary coach and previous defensive coordinator, and then he's gone to Green Bay and he's had more success there and has developed guys. Like I think those things are kind of telling that maybe him was just hard to work with. And George Stewart is another one, a receivers coach who was
Mm.
super popular, really related to the players well, and almost get the impression that he left because he wasn't being tough enough on the players. He was too relational. So
Yeah, there is a fine line with that too. So hopefully Kevin O'Connell can balance that line pretty well and not lean too far the other way. I think that'll be the key for Kevin O'Connell to be successful as the next Vikings coach.
yeah, yeah, I think it'll be easy for him to be the leader of the whole team. The offense sets the pace and the tone and all that, and how he interacts with and treats his defensive coordinator will be key. If he, like you said before, if he just reflects he trusts him, it's handled there and doesn't throw anybody under the bus. Zimmer almost took pride in that, like calling out a player, and like he was almost begrudging to even say anything positive about a guy in a press conference.
Mm.
Forget the coach speak, and like the thing with Mond, like I don't need to see him. I'm gonna start Sean
Oh
Mannion.
man.
I mean, you can think that, but
Yeah,
did
you don't say
did
it.
that, did that need to be said publicly, and did it need to be said that way? And you know, he probably thinks, well, if he doesn't have the toughness for that, he ain't gonna play a quarterback in the NFL. But I I don't know. Your job as a coach, like your job is to build the guy up as long as he's
Yeah.
there. Like,
Constructive criticism is
yeah,
one thing, but I
there's
mean to
there's
totally just embarrass the guy in front of the media, like goodness.
yeah. So yeah,
But all right, well, I think we've spent plenty of time on the Zimmer and Spielman and all that. As much as I mean, I could keep going on that, but let's talk a little bit about now. Obviously, the number one and number two goals have been done for the Vikings. They hired their GM, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, and they also got their head coach, Kevin O'Connell. They've hired their staff. So as we head into the off season, what are some of your main goals? So I think obviously the cap situation needs to be figured out. Um, but what do you feel are some of the number one goals that the Vikings should have for this offseason if they want to, especially if they want to compete like the Wilfs are saying for 2022?
Yeah, I think from a personnel standpoint, it's it's pretty simple. It's pretty clear. Um, they need improvement on the interior of the offensive line. They need two really impactful edge rushers, and they probably need two more cornerbacks. And between free agency and the draft, those are the things they have to get to, I think, be instantly competitive and in the playoff race in KOC's first year. Um, but of course, the elephant in the room is Kirk Cousins.
Yes, Kirk Cousins. Wait, who is that? Who is that? Is he important or anything?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, so my whole thing, the thing I've said, I probably said this a month ago, is I don't think there's any way the Vikings can keep both Daniil Hunter and Kirk Cousins. I just don't think that that's good. I mean, if you are able to restructure both of their deals, and also probably going to have to restructure other people, because my thought is the Vikings want to be able to spend money in free agency. They want to be able to have the cap to be able to sign even just their draft picks, which they don't have right now.
yeah,
But my thought is, if they can't get Kirk Cousins to sign an extension at a reasonable price, or if they can't get Daniil Hunter to do the same thing, like you can't. I mean, those are two huge cap hits. I just don't see them being able to fit on this roster unless some sort of a cap miracle, I guess, happens, which they could convert some of his money to a signing bonus and all
yeah,
that. I don't know how that could work with Kirk Cousins, but with Hunter that could work that way. But I I
yeah,
just don't see a very realistic world where both of those guys are back.
yeah. It's just crystal clear that those are the two contracts that they have to find a solution for. Um, and I think the appetite for extending Hunter is probably fine. Um, by the same token, Hunter's one guy that would have trade value, and they probably, will get calls from people about Daniil Hunter, and they'll need to consider those because that's a cap impact thing there to convert him into draft picks or other capital or whatever. And but also, you know, they didn't just wake up, at the end of the season and suddenly became aware of this. They've known this was coming, and I suspect in these rounds of interviews they've talked exactly about scenarios of how they're going to solve it. And I think they know. I think they know what their options are, but I don't think it's as easy as, oh, they like Cousins or they don't like him. Like I don't think that's what drives the decision at all. I think they like Cousins, and I think that they have no problem at all with him being their quarterback in 2022. They think he's a top tier quarterback, and they can have tremendous success with him. And we got to fix these other areas to help him perform better. I think
Yeah.
that's their assessment of him. But a $45 million cap hit really impacts the ability to, you know, fix that center guard position, get another edge rusher, you know, restock the cornerback shelf, stuff like that. We have no money with that 45 million number. And I don't think Cousins is wired in such a way that um, he's going to volunteer to do the Tom Brady thing. I think it's part of his faith that he's just literally trusting God. And I know that doesn't make sense to people, but he just feels like living on the edge. And, you know, I don't know. So the question is, do you figure out a way to eat it this year and you want to win now? And you can't do it without Cousins. Like you can't regress at quarterback and expect to win now. But you can't not improve the rest of the team and win now either. So something has to be done. So that's why I think the trade rumors are legit. Like it isn't just, they're saying, he's our guy, we like him, we're gonna help him, because that's what you'd say if you want to get maximum value for the guy. Um, you don't run them down. So you know, they took a call from Carolina reportedly, and I suspect they'll get other calls about him. And I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm ready to move on. I think Kirk Cousins has shown completely what he is as a quarterback. I mean, he's good, but not great. And he's not good enough to carry a team to a Super Bowl unless everything is perfect around him.
Yep.
And I think if he had a similar team with if you replaced him with Matthew Stafford in Los Angeles, maybe they'd be in that same position. But at the same time, I feel like Matthew Stafford takes more risks down the field than what Kirk Cousins does.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
maybe they wouldn't be in that same position. But I am ready to move on because I think they can at least get a first round draft pick. I would be shocked if they can't get a first round draft pick, considering how many teams are quarterback hungry right now.
Yep.
And especially if like Aaron Rodgers decides, nope, I'm retired. I'm gonna stay retired, or if he returns to Green Bay, then it's like, oh well, who are we gonna get? Jimmy Garoppolo or Kirk Cousins? I mean, those are kind of the two names that are out there.
Yep.
So, and then of course, there's a few excuse me, a few other names out there as well. Tom Brady potentially coming back to go to San Francisco, which is interesting to say the least.
Yep.
There's teams that need quarterbacks, and Kirk Cousins could definitely fit a need, and I think he's definitely worth a first round draft pick. If the Vikings can get a first round, or if the Vikings can give up a first round draft pick for Sam Bradford, I think the Vikings can easily get a first. Well, and we talked about how that was a panic move, but I still think Kirk Cousins is at least worth a first round pick. I mean, despite the contract issues, and maybe somebody would like to, have an extension before they would trade it for him, but
Sure. And that's the thing, for Minnesota, he's a $45 million number for this year. And for another team, the starting point is he's a $35 million number. And, Minnesota's going to have to eat 10. And then if you sign him to an extension, you can spread it out a little bit. So that's he costs Minnesota more to keep than he costs to be a solution for another team. And, Carolina, they have the sixth pick in the draft. That alone would be enough, I think, on Minnesota's side. They desperately need a
I would
quarterback
hope.
right now. That coach is going to lose his job if they don't win this year, and quarterback is what they need. I think Tampa. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that Bruce Arians is talking up Blaine Gabbert this week. That he's just never been on a good team like this. He's been on teams, like he's had some reps. I just can't imagine he can sell that in the locker room. That
He is not
we're
going
going to
to.
go from Tom Brady to Blaine Gabbert, and we're we're going to be in the hunt again. But I think that's what you say,
Yeah.
because if you're talking to Minnesota, we think Gabbert can be okay. We don't need him either. That's part
Well,
of the.
is it Colbert, the GM in Pittsburgh, that's like, well, yeah, if the season started today, Mason Rudolph would be our starting quarterback. Well,
Yeah,
really?
yeah, that's not much of an endorsement either. And the thing about Colbert on his way out there now is he's basically said, like, we didn't win enough games. Like, our standard has to be higher. We need to win. We
Yeah,
need to go deeper
Pittsburgh.
than this. And so that's a guy that,
They're
like,
used to winning.
they want a quarterback that can make them better. And Cousins would make them better. Cousins, that
Yeah.
would be a good fit. That's, run heavy offense and philosophy, strong defense like that. That would be a good landing spot. And they've got the cap space to work something out with Cousins if needed. So I think the Carolina thing is the most logical, but I think the Tampa Pittsburgh thing is legit. The downside on the Carolina thing is, what's the plan if you're going to just inherit Sam Darnold and you really aren't saving that much cap money? But I don't know. I think there's going to be plenty of conversations about this, and it seems most unlikely that they would extend him, other than if back against the wall they have to do voidable years to extend, to basically spread the cap hit over the next, and then just have dead money.
Yeah.
But these guys they're smart enough, like, they don't want to do that. And they brought in Ryan Grigson, the executive who'd been with the Browns, and he basically lost his job at Indianapolis because he didn't build around Andrew Luck. And he paid Andrew Luck. He didn't have any money left to build around him, and he lost his job over it. So I don't think he wants to do that again. So whatever pull he has with Kwesi on how you structure a roster and manage your cap, I think that's his input. So,
Well, and before we go on to your graphic here that really is interesting to me, I mentioned it last week on our show, actually. But the thing too with Kirk, like, is, I mean, it's not like he's a spring chicken anymore. I mean, he's 34 years old by the time the season starts next year. And, not every quarterback is going to be able to play till they're 40 or 45 years old in Tom Brady's case.
right.
So, like, to me, this is a perfect opportunity with a new regime that's come in, and you have this cap issue. I would try and trade him, and I would probably also try and trade some of the veterans on this team and just kind of get a fresh start. And I know the Wilfs would not like to hear that, because they're kind of all, let's go do this now, or at least they say that to the media. Maybe they do want a little
Yeah.
bit of a rebuild. I don't know.
Well,
I guess.
and I think that's, the Wilfs have made it clear they want to win now and they expect to win now. But now, okay, everybody's on board and everybody's talking. I'm sure the Wilfs are capable of changing their mind if the plan is laid out. Like, I don't know that we'll win the Super Bowl this year without Kirk, but I still think we'll make the playoffs. And here's why. We're going to be able to do this, this, and this. And yeah, this quarterback is not going to have the PFF grade that Kirk Cousins had, but productivity, here's the data, here's the analytics, here's what it looks like. It doesn't predict, past performance doesn't predict future results, but they're businessmen. They will relate to that if they have a plan. And I don't think they're necessarily personally fond of Cousins. He's made a lot of money from them, and they expected to go farther. So and he's shown kind of zero flexibility here now. So
Yeah.
I don't think that, you'd have to talk them off the ledge to move them.
Yeah, so I guess just from your point of view, what would be the ideal number if you had to keep Kirk Cousins? What would the ideal number be? I mean, we just showed your graphic here of how you would like the quarterback, and that's for the entire position, correct? Like the
Yep.
entire
Yep.
position to take up 31.2 million. So you'd probably want Kirk to be in the upper 20s area,
Yeah.
mid to upper 20s.
I think ideally 25 to 28. He's just never going to do that. So, um, so I don't know how you get there with him in one short year. So,
And my dad is watching. He just
there
said
you go.
no quarterback taking up more than 12 or 13% of the cap has ever won a Super Bowl. Kirk is at 22 or 23 right now.
Yep.
And I think Matthew Stafford might have been the first time ever that it's been, because I think he was over
Well,
12%. But
the thing with the Rams was they had Stafford and
they
dead
have
money.
two of the best
They,
players
they had dead money
in
from
the
God.
world on
So,
that defense,
yeah.
too. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, they have. The Vikings don't. I mean, as good as Danielle Hunter is, he's not Aaron Donald, and Jalen Ramsey is by far the best quarterback or cornerback. I mean, I think anyway in the league. I mean, he gets burned every now and then, I guess, but most corners do these days. Um, but um, but yeah, I mean, you have two of the best players at their position on defense, and then you had a really good offense. That's
Yeah.
the Vikings don't
Doing
have that.
Yeah, the Rams doing what they did with all that dead money to Goff, who was gone, and what they paid Stafford, exceeded what is normally healthy. Um, it's a challenge for everybody. So, even though, like I'm saying, I would want to allocate only 15% max for that position. That's easy to do if you hit on a young guy and you have his first 5 years on his rookie contract, and then it's hard to stay there if you hit on that guy and he's really, really good, and then you have to pay him. So you're going to have to flex. I mean, you're not going to, well, this was great. We drafted Patrick Mahomes and he was great, but his 5 years are up and we're going to let him go now. Like, you know, you probably don't do that, because for every Patrick Mahomes, there's a Christian Ponder in your history. So,
Yeah, well, and that's a lot of the argument about people who want Kirk to stay is, well, what are the odds of you getting another Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or whoever? Well, it's going to be zero if you don't try, for one.
yeah.
And for
And
two, I mean, you
yeah,
don't necessarily, if you have the pieces around the quarterback, you don't necessarily need a top three quarterback to go win a Super Bowl. But I mean, you still need him to be good.
yeah.
But I mean,
Because
then
you could make the case that they would have been as successful with Teddy Bridgewater at
oh
about half
yeah,
the price
I
as they
mean, they
were
won
with.
10 games one time in the last 4 years. So, I
And
mean,
that's, I think
it's not a
everybody
hard
would
one.
agree that Cousins is a good quarterback,
Yeah.
but he's not 45 million a year good. He just
Mm.
he just isn't, and that's really what it's about. Not, you know, and I think most people do have him fairly accurately evaluated. They can't mix the cap thing with that evaluation. So,
Yeah. Well, let's have you talk a little bit about just how you kind of came up with these numbers and specifically why for each position group, why that amount of money, if you would.
yeah. So, um, it, basically, I think there's been the philosophy that you build through the draft, and then you need to get guys on their rookie contracts but you know you have to mix that with paying guys too. Like you have to selectively pay guys either to keep them or to get as free agents. Like what the Chiefs did, they rebuilt their offensive line in one season from, that was the reason they lost the Super Bowl to Tampa to, I think they think it was Bieniemy's fault now, but um, they did that overnight and they invested their money there. That's how they did it, and they had the cap flexibility to do it. So I just think that there's two positions that that maybe philosophically you say we're going to need to cycle through rookie contract guys here, and that's running back and tight end. I think the role that tight ends have, it's not unimportant, but the supply and demand of guys that can play that position and where you have to draft them and stuff like that, I think you can essentially, you can draft one every year, and whether they were in the, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth round, you can find guys that can make your team and contribute and play a role in an offense. And you look at the Rams, they had Tyler Higbee and Kendall Blanton and Bryson, um, the third tight end. And none of those guys are super household names. I can't even remember the kid's name on the third one, um, but they were all very effective in that offense. And this Doyle Schubert really knows his stuff.
Yep, my dad talking about the whole Spielman thing. I think that's interesting because really it was Spielman that thought this was a good idea to bring
Yeah,
in Kirk
and
Cousins.
yeah,
So
and that's the thing, and I think he had to have known it at the time. It was all in on Cousins, and if we don't go somewhere, I'm done. So he couldn't have been super shocked. I think maybe he thought he was going to get another lifeline because Zimmer had kind of imploded on the other side of this. But yeah, so his strategy, it just didn't work, and I think this is a model, and like I said, I would just go into it with that philosophy. I think running backs are easier to find. I think a lot of good teams have nondescript running backs, and they get a lot of production out of them, and they're involved in the passing game. And when you have a blue chip running back, then you're almost forced to build everything around that guy, and that just inherently leads to a predictability on offense that doesn't serve the whole success of the team. And when you're going to be stretched on that is when you hit on a guy like Dalvin Cook, who is so good, so explosive, so impactful. Like, do you keep him or do you not keep him? At the time, as much as I like the player, I would have let him go. Like, I would have rolled with the next guy, and I would have young guys in the pipeline. And I think with Madison and Nwangwu, they've got two young guys right there that I think they hit on. And they paid Dalvin, so probably when Madison gets there, he'll be free, like Jerick McKinnon was, and he'll get paid by somebody. Um, but they'll find a role for Nwangwu, and I think that's just what you do at that position because you want the money somewhere else. And I think where you invest the money is the offensive line, defensive line. Like, I just think that's, the better those guys are, the better all these other positions are. So that's where you give second contracts to guys there. You go get free agents there. And in this scenario, defensive line would be the defensive, a defensive tackle and the edge guys, in a 3-4. I wouldn't call those edge guys linebackers. And linebacker would be another position I would skimp on, particularly in a 3-4 where you essentially only have two guys. And you can draft guys in the early to middle rounds and keep that restocked. And I don't think you need to invest. So that's where Anthony Barr would need to be an impact edge player to have re-signed him for what they did. But that isn't what he was playing. And, maybe they wouldn't have paid Kendricks what they did in this scenario. And, that'd be how I do it. Now corners, you almost have to have 3 quality corners now to compete in this game. So, you're going to have to spend money to get and or keep talent at that level. And then I think you can coach up safeties, and I don't know that, I'd be hard pressed to ever pay big money for a kicker.
Yeah.
But they
Maybe
they
given the Vikings history, though.
exactly. And they essentially drafted one, with Carlson, but he had a slump and he got squirted out. And I'm sure they wish they would have just hung in there on him now. But now he just got paid. So I don't know if you would have wanted that ultimately. And the better thing was, however many years ago, Stephen Hauschka was an undrafted free agent that the Vikings signed. And I think, he got cut because he was competing with Ryan Longwell at the time. Well, he went on to play 9 seasons and, hit 85% of his kicks. And, a guy like that would have been just fine, so.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the running back position, like you said, like I would have probably traded Dalvin like 2 years ago. About I think the year after he came back from his ACL, I think that was when he like kind of was at his peak value. I think that's when it was. I would have probably traded him then because now it's at the point where you are probably going to not get too much because he's getting up there a little bit. I mean, he's not like old, but for
Yeah.
running backs, I mean, he's getting up there a little bit.
Yeah. And if you have a great player, you're going to need to stress, this model, and make decisions. And maybe Dalvin's a guy like that you have 10 million at running back because you've got that. But I just think it depletes you somewhere else. And look at Dallas. They paid big money to keep Zeke Elliott too, and they've got deficiencies elsewhere.
Yeah,
And
their
it's
defense has suffered.
underachieved. And the Vikings, have they've tried to build a good offensive line, but they've never really paid for one. They've always got that kind of second tier in free agency, and they overpaid for the guys they got. Whether that was Riley Reef or Remmers or Boone, guys like that. Good players, but they were sort of the Kirk Cousins of offensive linemen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, I think too, like you mentioned building a team around a running back, and that's pretty much what the Vikings were doing before they signed Kirk Cousins. I mean, they liked Dalvin Cook and they wanted to extend him and all that, but then it's like, oh, well, now you're spending money, bulk money, over $10 million per player on both your quarterback and running back, which tells me, if you're, and I'm not saying that you'd have to spend less than 10 million on your quarterback if you're paying your running back that much, but I would be spending less than $20 million a year for sure on a quarterback, and maybe even less than that if I'm paying my running back as much money as I'm paying Dalvin Cook, because you can't, and at least in my world, in my mind, you can't really do that where you pay your quarterback big top money, top 5 money, and then pay your running back in the top 10 as well, because you're basically saying, well, we're building our team around our running back, but oh, we got this quarterback too. Well, which one are you going to build your team around? I mean, you want to be a balanced team, but I think there's going to be lots of other deficiencies on your team when you're spending that kind of money on both quarterback and running back.
Yeah, totally agree.
So
Yeah, Kirk's a good quarterback, but they overpaid for him. They overpaid for him from the start. He was the best of the free agent crop that year, but they overpaid to get him. What if the Jets had landed him instead of the Vikings? What if they offered
yeah,
more money, and what if he'd have gone there? I, I don't think there's any way he's on the books for 45 million with the Jets this year. He would have already failed miserably and been cut and been on to his next thing. So because
yeah,
he there's no way he would have elevated the Jets out of that supporting cast and that situation.
right.
It would have been even worse than here. So
Well, in the last 15 minutes or so, Kevin, I think I want to try and get your ideas on some top targets for the Vikings in free agency and the draft. I know you're kind of a draft guru a little bit, so before we get to the draft, how about free agency since that comes up first? Who are some of your free agent targets that you'd like to see the Vikings go after?
well, I think you know I don't know what hope they have for Wyatt Davis, um, or how much more patience they have for
Mike
Brad.
Zimmer had none, so
Exactly, exactly. But he's talented enough. He's talented enough to be a starter, at whether it's guard or center. And I think another guy that maybe could have gotten playing time at center was Blake Brandel. They experimented with him in training camp a little bit, and as the season went on, they used him in some packages more, and I think he would have held up better inside. And also, I wouldn't give up on Udo. I think he's a really talented player, and he's a big, athletic, long-armed, long-limbed guy. But he gets sloppy with his hands and technique, and he stops finishing. He doesn't finish his blocks, so he initiates contact and then he stops his feet, and then that creates angles which lead to holding penalties. And so I think that's a coachable thing still. But that said, they need to add at least one interior offensive lineman, I think, via free agency. And I think Brandon Scherf from Washington, I just saw before the show here that it doesn't look like him and Washington are going to work anything out. And to me, he's this year's Joe Thuney. So if if they can manipulate the cap space, I think that's a guy you look at and target. And I think two other guys that I think would also be solid would be James Daniels with Chicago, who's a guy I really liked coming out and kind of had targeted for the Vikings. And then the other is Austin Corbett, solid starter with the Rams. Not great, but from what I'm seeing, um, you could get him for good money. And then if you really don't think you have a solution at all at center, I think the top guy is Jensen with Tampa. Um, he is the thing about him. He's a pretty good anchor on pass protection. He's not super athletic and mobile, but he can anchor. And so I think those are the candidates on the O line. And then I think at corner, I think this Kyle Fuller, who spent last year with Denver, used to be with the Bears. Um, Donatel, be familiar with him. I think he's kind of considered a little lower down on the list of guys, but I think that would be a good fit. I would seriously just re-sign Patrick Peterson, and then the other guy I like for them would be Travarius Ward from the Chiefs. I think that's a young guy with the ability to really live up to a second contract level, and he's got the length and cover skills, and can be coached up. And I think that's another guy that would be on the list. So that would be the only places I really would look in free agency.
Yeah.
They'll add some guys to fill holes, probably after the draft if they feel like they missed something. But the big money, you know, at least one offensive lineman, at least one corner. If there's an edge guy out there, I'm just not sure that you know they can with their cap situation. I just don't know how they pull that off. But
Yeah.
they might be able to get a discount guy because the scheme they're running. That's one of the things that from a cap standpoint. Um, I think the 3-4 scheme is easier to supply for because I think there's more prospects that always fit that tweener defensive end stand up linebacker role, that edge guy versus a true base 4-3 end. I think they're harder to come by. So, that's why when you get a Daniil Hunter, you really hit a home run on him. But Daniil Hunter can play any scheme. So
Yeah.
he'd be fine. So I think, you look at like what the Packers have taken Zadarius Smith and they drafted Rashawn Gary, but they've done it with not necessarily blue chip guys. They've developed them, and I think that's easier to do at that position. But a pure, in the trenches end is harder to come by. And then defensive tackles, basically your defensive ends in a 3-4 are defensive tackles, and they're two gap guys, and there's less separation in the talent, and then and Aaron Donald, doesn't really fit, but he's Aaron Donald, so you get him on the field and you line him up against somebody and see what happens. But he's not a fit for a 3-4. But I think they just won the whole thing with him, and probably because of him. So
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Very good. Well, I would like to ask you questions about the free agents. I think Brandon Sheriff would be great, but the cap situation may prevent the Vikings from giving him the offer that he wants, even though he is rumored to want to come to play with the Vikings, potentially as one of his targets, which I would love it. I'm an Iowa Hawkeye fan as well, so I mean that would be great.
sure.
And I think offensive linemen are playing into their 30s. I mean, look at Andrew Whitworth. I mean, 40 years old and he won a Super Bowl. So I mean, it's you could probably sign Brandon Sheriff for 5 years and be okay at that position.
Yeah. No,
So
I agree. Um, yeah, he'd be my top target. They know those other two guys too that I mentioned. Daniels. I mean, Pettin was at Chicago last year, and Corbett was with the Rams, and that those guys would both be scheme fits. Daniels is more athletic, probably the most athletic of all three of those.
yeah,
But they'll be pursued by other teams too, and you're right. Like whatever their cap situation, whatever their plan is to resolve their cap, and they know what it is. They're going to have to do it if they want to compete here, and
yep,
usually you don't get the best deals in the first wave. So, to get a guy like Scherf, maybe it's he wants to come there, and he
yeah,
doesn't just chase the money, to sign with the terrible team with 73 million in cap space. But I would think a team like Cincinnati would be wanting him, and
yeah,
I think they've got 73 million in cap space. So he might want to play for Minnesota, but Cincinnati just went to the Super Bowl too. So
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
yeah,
So
tough.
well. Yeah, well, let's move over to the draft here quickly before we let you go. A few draft targets that you have for the Vikings coming up here in the draft. I know you have just kind of initially started doing some work on it, and so just kind of curious initially, kind of what your thoughts are on some good potential pieces for the Vikings in the draft.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, they're picking 12th as it sits right now. And I think picking that high, you have to pick the best guy, regardless of position. Like, so we'll talk about the position guys, but like, I think they need to take the top guy if he's there. I mean, if Aaron Donald slides down, and not that there's an Aaron Donald in this class, but uh, you don't pass on him because you have Dalvin Tomlinson and Michael Pierce. Like, you take that guy. Um, but that said, I don't think that's likely to happen. So I think you got cornerback and edge are the two most likely positions to go at early. And I think at corner, I think there's three guys that could be there and would be great value then. I think that's Ahmad Sauce Gardner from Cincinnati. He's got a really high upside. I think Derek Stingley is super talented. Uh, you know, both those guys are very much potential elite, you know, number one cornerback, shutdown guys and playmakers. And then Trent McDuffie is a really clean prospect from Washington. And then edge guys, I think I don't I don't know. I think the guy from Purdue, George Karloftis, and David Ajabu from Michigan are the two guys that kind of fit in that range. Um, they would fit. A guy I really like is this boy Mafe from Minnesota. Super explosive young athlete with, I think, a really high ceiling, but that's not a guy you take at 12. So if there's a trade involved and they end up with a pick, later in the round, um, or even second round, maybe a guy like that. But they need to draft an edge guy. I mean, they've got prospects, and some of those guys could be special. And like a Janarius Robinson is super talented, but you're not going to bypass drafting a guy because you like his upside. So, and I think Wanham has maybe a little more potential, but I think it's limited. So you need another impact guy. And
Do you do you think that, if you're drafting at 12, do you really think there's any good options on the offensive line? Because I know, as we said, Brandon Sheriff has kind of some ties in Iowa to family, or as my dad had pointed out. I don't really see a great prospect at that period, just from initially looking.
the
But
center from Iowa,
yeah, Linderbaum, right.
Linderbaum, is the guy that interior offensive lineman. I think that's a little bit of a reach at 12, but um, he could go anywhere from then to 18, 20.
Yeah.
So maybe you kind of do what Spielman did last year, and you kind of trade your way down and accumulate picks, and you're targeting Linderbaum, or maybe another guy that's an interior offensive lineman. Because it's a fairly deep draft for that. It's just not there's not these elite guys at the very top. I mean, one might go, very early, but yeah.
Of the corners, I would say to me the one that makes the most sense in terms of a plug and play and kind of the playmaker type and just an outstanding build for a cornerback is Sauce Gardner. I mean, 6'3", 200 pounds. I think it's going to be interesting to see what he runs at the combine. But if he's running a 4.4 or less, and he's got that kind of length, oh man, that would
Yeah,
be fun.
like that's physical prototype of what you need to try to play with a Devontae Adams.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying problem solved or anything, but like that's the skill set you need to try to clamp him. And when Xavier Rhodes was truly in his prime on the top of his game, he could do that to premier receivers. He could frustrate them, and this guy Sauce, I think he has that kind of talent, but he's even, he's just naturally fluid hips and just this natural length and burst and yeah.
Yeah.
And also, Stingley is a very talented guy too.
Mm-hmm.
He's had more like concentration lapse stuff, but you know he's more he's an even more talented Trevon Diggs. In my
Yeah.
mind,
Yep.
a playmaker type of guy that you know he even return punts and stuff. And I think McDuffie does punts too, and he's just a solid all around player. Steps right in and starts. Maybe more of an Antoine Winfield caliber pro career. Um,
Yeah. Sweet. Well, I think we're going to go into our final statements. It is kind of a culmination of everything you're thinking in terms of the Vikings and upcoming, with draft free agency and, just what you're looking forward to and all that kind of stuff. So I'll let you go first, Kevin, and then we'll wrap up.
okay. Well, it's the most exciting time of the year. When the Super
Yeah.
Bowl's over, if your team wasn't in it, the Super Bowl's over and next year begins and it's team building season. So it's just a really exciting time, and with new GM head coach, it's a great opportunity to learn stuff. Like learn what's different, what's new ideas, new attitudes. It's a full-on youth movement at the top there, and I think that that's good, and I think that's going to be successful and sustainable for a long time. And I would expect that they'll start developing coaches that get poached because they have success and are good. But they're in a tough transition year, but they've got a fair amount of draft picks. Spielman left them with some extra picks, and they're smart people. They'll figure it out. But it isn't just a blind, analytics thing either. It's a blending of football information with data. And I think they're starting off on the right page there. And I think they're going to have success. And I think they can and should make the playoffs. Whether Rodgers leaves Green Bay or stays, I think they should be
Whether
in the,
Kirk stays or leaves?
whether Kirk stays or leaves too. And yeah, so and I don't know him staying or leaving. I don't know if it's more likely that he stays and goes. I really don't. I don't think they've said anything convincing that they've got it figured out to keep him.
Yeah. The NFC is pretty open, I feel like.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's and the Rams won the Super Bowl, but they could have easily lost two of the games.
Yeah.
Getting there, and the big show they could have just as easily lost too. So, I mean, the Vikings have a long history of not making those plays, but there was the Minneapolis Miracle when they did. So, at
Yep.
some point, hopefully the talent and the synergy between everybody is good enough that you can overcome the one play here, the one play there, and you can just win. So,
Well, Kevin, we really appreciate you taking the time today. You can follow him on Twitter at Kevin Brown NFL. And I definitely would love to have you back on as we get closer to the draft too. And I'm sure you'll do more studying on some of these players that are going to be available in the draft. And maybe the Vikings will have another draft pick in that first round by the time the draft rolls around. We'll see.
that would certainly add to the excitement.
Yeah, absolutely. So. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to having you on again.
Outstanding. Look forward to it. Thanks, Carson.
You bet. And we appreciate everybody that watched us here today as well. And we'll look forward to having another episode in the near future. We might take off next week and then be back in March when things get closer to the start of free agency and all that good stuff. So appreciate everybody, and Skol.